The silence in the Pentagon's classified briefing room was deafening as 6 Army colonels turned their backs on Major Samantha, Sam Rhodes, effectively shutting her out of the most critical intelligence meeting in decades. What they didn't know was that the unassuming intelligence analyst they just dismissed carried credentials that would make even generals salute. In less than 10 minutes, she would reveal a badge that would force every one of them to apologize and change the course of American military intelligence forever. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Conference Room Delta 7, deep within the Pentagon's most secure wing. The room smelled of stale coffee and the particular tension that came with handling classified information that could alter the balance of global power. Charts covered the walls, satellite imagery of Middle Eastern compounds, terrorist network diagrams, and red-stamped documents that most people would never see. Outside the reinforced windows, the Virginia morning sun struggled through bulletproof glass, casting harsh shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel James Hartwell stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his uniform pressed to knife-edge precision. At 58, he commanded respect through decades of service, 3 combat tours, and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a career built on traditional military excellence. Behind him, a classified PowerPoint presentation glowed on the wall-mounted screen. Operation Silent Thunder, classified eyes only. Around the table sat 5 other colonels, each representing different branches of military intelligence. Colonel Marcus Webb from Army Intelligence, his thick frame filling out his dress blues. Colonel Patricia Hayes from Air Force Intelligence, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her ice blue eyes missing nothing. Colonel David Chun from Marine Intelligence, compact and intense, his hands folded precisely on the table. Colonel Robert Kane from Naval Intelligence, weathered from years at sea, his face showing the particular tan that came from shipboard service. Colonel Lisa Martinez from Defense Intelligence Agency, sharp-featured and sharp-minded, her pen already taking rapid notes. They were the Pentagon's elite intelligence council, the 6 officers who decided which operations received funding, which threats warranted immediate action, and which analysts got access to the most sensitive information in the American intelligence apparatus. Between them, they held over 150 years of combined experience, multiple advanced degrees, and security clearances that granted access to some of the most closely guarded secrets in the world. And they had just locked out Major Samantha Rhodes. Sam stood in the hallway outside Conference Room Delta 7, her hand still extended toward the door handle that had been turned against her. At 29, she looked younger than her rank suggested, something that had been both a blessing and a curse throughout her military career. Her auburn hair was regulation length, pulled back in a simple bun that emphasized her sharp green eyes. She wore standard Army dress blues without the chest full of ribbons that marked combat veterans, without the special tabs and patches that commanded immediate respect in military circles. What the colonel saw was a junior officer, probably someone's aide, possibly a briefing assistant who'd gotten confused about which meetings she was authorized to attend. What they didn't see was the small, discreet badge pinned to the inside of her jacket, a badge that most military personnel would never recognize, but which represented authority that superseded rank, branch, and traditional chains of command. The exclusion had happened smoothly, professionally, with the kind of military courtesy that made rejection seem like kindness. Colonel Hartwell had opened the door when she'd knocked, taken one look at her major's insignia, and smiled the patronizing smile reserved for junior officers who'd overstepped their bounds. "Major, I think there's been some confusion," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority mixed with condescension. "This briefing is for senior intelligence officials only. Perhaps you're looking for the administrative meeting down the hall." Sam had tried to respond, to explain her purpose, but Hartwell had already turned back to his colleagues. "Gentlemen, ladies, shall we proceed? We have sensitive material to cover." The door had closed with a soft but definitive click, leaving Sam alone in the hallway with her leather briefcase and a growing sense that she was about to teach 6 very experienced officers a lesson about assumptions. She could hear their voices through the thick door, muffled but audible. They were discussing Operation Silent Thunder, a joint task force mission targeting a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks against American interests in Central Asia. Intelligence suggested the cell had acquired weapons-grade plutonium and was actively developing dirty bombs for deployment in major American cities. What the colonels didn't know, what they couldn't know without her presence in the room, was that their intelligence was not only outdated but dangerously incomplete. The terrorist cell they were planning to target had been compromised 6 weeks ago. The weapons-grade plutonium was already in transit not to Central Asia, but to sleeper cells operating within the continental United States. Sam knew this because she had been the primary intelligence officer embedded with the joint CIA Special Operations Task Force that had uncovered the real plot. She knew this because she had spent the last 18 months living under deep cover in Afghanistan and Pakistan, gathering human intelligence that no satellite or electronic surveillance could provide. She knew this because she carried clearances and authorizations that went far beyond what her major's oak leaves would suggest. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she stood, locked out of a briefing about an operation she had essentially designed, by officers who were about to make decisions based on information she knew to be fatally flawed. In approximately 8 minutes, they would approve a mission that would not only fail to prevent a terrorist attack but would actually accelerate the timeline by alerting the wrong targets. Sam reached into her jacket and touched the small badge pinned there, a simple piece of metal and enamel that represented one of the most exclusive and secretive organizations within the American intelligence community. The Joint Special Operations Command Intelligence Support Activity, known to those with clearance simply as the unit. Membership was by invitation only, required presidential-level security clearances, and granted authority to override conventional military hierarchies when national security was at immediate risk. She had been recruited into the unit 18 months ago, not for her rank or her traditional qualifications, but for her unique combination of linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and operational intuition that had made her the most successful deep-cover intelligence officer of her generation. Her official military record showed a standard career path: intelligence analysis, language training, desk assignments. Her classified record told a different story: successful infiltration of terrorist networks, extraction of high-value human intelligence, and operational successes that had prevented multiple attacks on American soil. The colonels inside conference room Delta 7 were operating under the assumption that rank equaled authority, that experience equaled knowledge, that their decades of service automatically qualified them to make decisions about operations they had never personally conducted. They were about to learn that in the modern intelligence world, traditional hierarchies sometimes gave way to specialized expertise and presidential-level authorization. Sam checked her watch. 7 minutes until they would vote on the operation. 7 minutes to prevent a catastrophic intelligence failure. 7 minutes to prove that competence and authority didn't always wear the insignia that people expected. She straightened her uniform, picked up her briefcase, and walked back to the door of conference room Delta 7. This time, she wouldn't knock. This time, she would enter with the authority she'd been granted by officials whose names these colonels would recognize immediately. This time, they would listen. The badge hidden in her jacket seemed to grow heavier as she reached for the door handle. In a few moments, she would transform from a dismissed junior officer into someone whose authority they couldn't question, whose presence they couldn't deny, whose intelligence they desperately needed. The real briefing was about to begin. Major Samantha Rhodes had always been underestimated, and she'd learned to use it as a weapon. At 29, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made her perfect for intelligence work. Average height, average build, the sort of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. In civilian clothes, she could blend into any crowd from a college campus to a diplomatic reception. In uniform, she looked like exactly what the colonels had assumed. A junior officer who'd probably spent her career pushing papers in air-conditioned offices, analyzing satellite photos and writing reports that other people used to make real decisions. They couldn't have been more wrong. Sam had been born Samantha Catherine Rhodes in Cedar Falls, Iowa, to parents who ran a small-town hardware store and had never imagined their daughter would one day speak fluent Arabic, Pashto, Farsi, and Urdu. Her childhood had been aggressively normal honor roll student, debate team captain, homecoming court, the kind of all-American background that made intelligence agencies salivate when they found it combined with the right psychological profile and intellectual capabilities. West Point had been her first real challenge, her first encounter with the assumption that academic excellence didn't necessarily translate to military leadership. She'd graduated 15th in a class of 900, but more importantly, she'd caught the attention of intelligence recruiters who recognized something rare: the ability to think several moves ahead while maintaining absolute calm under pressure. Her early career had followed a predictable trajectory: military intelligence officer basic course, language training at the Defense Language Institute, assignments to safe, prestigious positions that utilized her analytical skills while keeping her far from any actual danger. Fort Meade, Langley, the Pentagon. Clean assignments with excellent efficiency reports and zero operational experience. Or so it appeared on her official record. What her official record didn't show was the 18 months she'd spent in Pakistan's tribal regions, living in a compound with the family of a tribal elder who'd been secretly feeding information to American intelligence for over a decade. It didn't mention the 6 weeks she'd spent in a Taliban-controlled village in Afghanistan, gathering intelligence on weapons smuggling routes while posing as an aid worker from a humanitarian organization that existed only on paper. It certainly didn't detail her recruitment into the unit, the invitation that had come not through normal channels but through a phone call from a blocked number and a meeting in an unmarked office building in Northern Virginia where she'd been interviewed by people whose names she was never told and whose faces she was instructed to forget. The unit existed in the shadow spaces of American intelligence, operating under presidential finding that granted authority to bypass normal military and intelligence hierarchies when immediate national security interests were at stake. Its members were drawn from across the intelligence community: the CIA, DIA, NSA, military intelligence, but they answered to a command structure that existed outside traditional bureaucracies. Sam's recruitment had been based on a combination of factors that made her uniquely valuable: linguistic capabilities that allowed her to operate in the cultural complexity of Central and South Asia, psychological testing that showed extraordinary resilience under stress, and operational results that spoke for themselves. In 18 months of deep cover work, she had developed intelligence sources that had prevented 4 separate terrorist attacks and provided actionable intelligence that led to the capture or elimination of 37 high-value targets. None of this was reflected in the military personnel file that the 6 colonels would have reviewed if they'd bothered to request her background before dismissing her from their meeting. Her jacket showed a standard intelligence career: analyst positions, language training, staff assignments. Clean, safe, unremarkable. The dichotomy was intentional. The unit's most effective officers were those who could operate in plain sight, whose official records provided perfect cover for their actual capabilities. Sam appeared to be exactly what she was supposed to appear to be: a bright young major with excellent analytical skills and no operational experience, the kind of officer who briefed senior officials but never made decisions herself. Standing in the Pentagon hallway, listening to the muffled voices of 6 colonels discussing an operation based on intelligence she knew to be fatally compromised, Sam reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she'd been analyzing signals intelligence in a basement office at Fort Meade, identifying patterns in communications intercepts and writing reports that disappeared into the vast bureaucracy of American intelligence. Today, she carried authorization signed by officials whose names would make those same colonels stand at attention, and knowledge that could prevent attacks on American soil. The transformation hadn't been gradual. It had been sudden, total, and invisible to anyone without the security clearances to access her classified record. The irony wasn't lost on her. The military culture that had shaped her also constrained her, creating assumptions about authority and capability based on rank and appearance rather than actual qualifications. The same system that had trained her to think strategically also trained others to discount her input based on the oak leaves on her collar and her unremarkable appearance. But Sam had learned to work within these constraints, to use underestimation as camouflage. Let people assume she was just another staff officer with good analytical skills and no real-world experience. Let them see the surface-level credentials while remaining blind to the deeper capabilities. It made her more effective, not less. Through the door of Conference Room Delta 7, she could hear Colonel Hartwell outlining the proposed operation parameters. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent decades making military decisions, but Sam could detect the subtle uncertainty underneath. They were working with incomplete information, and at some level they knew it. What they didn't know was that their incomplete information wasn't just outdated. it was actively dangerous. The intelligence they were relying on had been carefully crafted by the very terrorist network they were hoping to disrupt, fed through channels designed to misdirect American operations away from the real threat. Sam knew this because she'd been there when the deception was planned, sitting in a compound in the mountains of northern Pakistan, wearing the clothes and speaking the language of someone the terrorists trusted completely. She'd watched them laugh as they fed false intelligence through their captured sources, confident that American arrogance would prevent anyone from questioning information that confirmed what the Americans wanted to believe. The terrorist cell operating in Central Asia was real, but it was also a deliberate distraction. While American intelligence focused on the obvious threat, the real operation was moving forward in American cities, using networks and resources that had taken years to establish and position. In approximately 6 minutes, the colonels would vote to approve Operation Silent Thunder, committing American Special Operations Forces to a mission that would accomplish exactly what the terrorists wanted: misdirection of American attention and resources away from the actual threat. Sam touched the badge hidden in her jacket one more time, feeling the weight of authority it represented. In a few moments, she would walk back into that room, not as the dismissed junior officer they'd assumed her to be, but as someone whose credentials they couldn't question and whose intelligence they desperately needed. The underestimation was about to end. The real conversation was about to begin. And 6 very experienced colonels were about to learn that in the modern intelligence world, authority and expertise didn't always wear the insignia they expected. The tension in Conference Room Delta 7 was palpable as the 6 colonels settled into their final preparations, unaware that their most critical briefing was about to be interrupted by someone they'd already dismissed. Colonel James Hartwell stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his laser pointer tracing red dots across satellite imagery that flickered on the wall-mounted screen. The room's atmosphere was thick with the weight of classified information and the particular intensity that came with planning operations where American lives hung in the balance. Colonel Marcus Webb leaned back in his leather chair, his thick frame radiating the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years climbing the intelligence hierarchy. His fingers drummed quietly against the table's surface as he reviewed the operational parameters one final time. Webb had cut his teeth during the Cold War, when intelligence work was cleaner, more predictable. Enemies wore uniforms and operated from known locations. This new world of asymmetric warfare and terrorist networks operating from shadow compounds made him uncomfortable, but he'd adapted his methods to match the evolving threat landscape. Across from Webb, Colonel Patricia Hayes adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and made precise notations in the margins of her classified briefing book. At 46, she was the youngest colonel at the table, having fast-tracked through Air Force intelligence on the strength of her analytical brilliance and her ability to synthesize massive amounts of disparate information into actionable intelligence. Hayes had earned her reputation by successfully predicting 3 separate terrorist attacks based on pattern analysis of communications intercepts and financial transactions. Her colleagues respected her methodical approach and her uncanny ability to see connections that others missed. Colonel David Chun sat motionless, his compact frame coiled with the particular energy of someone who'd spent years in the field before transitioning to strategic planning. Unlike his colleagues, Chun had operational experience in the regions they were discussing. He'd led Marine reconnaissance units through the mountains of Afghanistan, had personally conducted raids on terrorist safe houses, had looked into the eyes of captured insurgents during interrogations. That field experience gave weight to his strategic recommendations, but it also made him more cautious about operations based solely on electronic intelligence. At the far end of the table, Colonel Robert Kane reviewed maritime intelligence reports with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades tracking submarine movements and naval activities. Kane's expertise was ostensibly outside the scope of Operation Silent Thunder, but his inclusion reflected the operation's complexity. Intelligence suggested the terrorist cell might be using shipping containers to transport materials through international waters, making naval intelligence crucial to understanding the full scope of the threat. Colonel Lisa Martinez represented the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's premier intelligence organization. At 51, she'd built her career on human intelligence operations, developing networks of sources and assets across the Middle East and Central Asia. Martinez understood better than her colleagues that electronic surveillance and satellite imagery could only provide part of the picture. Real intelligence came from human sources, from people willing to risk their lives to provide information that could prevent attacks on American soil. Together, these 6 officers represented over 150 years of combined intelligence experience. They'd lived through the transformation of American intelligence from Cold War state versus state competition to the murky world of non-state actors and asymmetric threats. They'd adapted their methods, updated their technologies, and refined their analytical techniques to match evolving challenges. But they were also products of a system that equated rank with authority, experience with expertise, and credentials with competence. The military culture that had shaped their careers emphasized hierarchy, deference to senior officers, and respect for established chains of command. These weren't negative traits. They were essential for military effectiveness, but they could create blind spots when situations didn't conform to standard patterns. Colonel Hartwell clicked to the next slide, displaying a detailed schematic of a compound in the mountains of northern Afghanistan. Intelligence indicates this facility has been used for weapons storage and training operations, he explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. Satellite imagery shows recent construction activity, suggesting preparation for a significant operation. The other colonels leaned forward, studying the grainy photographs with professional interest. Webb noted the defensive positions around the compound's perimeter. Hayes calculated probable occupancy based on the size of the structures. Chun evaluated potential approach routes for Special Operations Forces. Kane assessed possible escape routes through mountain passes. Martinez considered the human intelligence requirements for confirming the facility's actual purpose. What none of them knew was that the compound they were studying so intently had been abandoned 6 weeks earlier. The satellite imagery they were analyzing showed carefully staged activity designed to maintain the illusion of ongoing operations while the real terrorist network had relocated to urban safe houses in major American cities. The deception was sophisticated, multi-layered, and specifically designed to exploit American intelligence gathering methods. The terrorists understood that American planners relied heavily on electronic surveillance and satellite imagery, so they created a target that would appear significant to those technologies while being operationally worthless. More critically, they'd used captured American intelligence sources to feed confirming information through established channels. Communications intercepts, financial transactions, and human intelligence reports all pointed toward the abandoned compound as a critical node in the terrorist network. The intelligence wasn't just wrong. It was expertly crafted to be believable to experienced analysts who knew what to look for in genuine intelligence. Outside in the hallway, Major Samantha Rhodes remained perfectly still, her ear pressed lightly against the door of conference room Delta 7. Her expression was calm, professional, but her mind was racing through the implications of what she was hearing. Every piece of intelligence the colonels were discussing matched exactly with the disinformation campaign she'd observed firsthand during her deep cover operation in Pakistan. She'd been present in the room when terrorist leaders had laughed about their success in misdirecting American intelligence efforts. She'd listened to them describe their strategy for maintaining the illusion of operations in Afghanistan while their real assets moved into position in American cities. She'd watched them coordinate with sleeper cells already positioned in New York, Washington, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The irony was devastating. 6 of America's most experienced intelligence officers were about to approve an operation that would accomplish exactly what their enemies wanted: the commitment of American Special Operations Forces to a target of no strategic value while the real threat remained undetected and unopposed. Sam could hear Colonel Martinez raising questions about source reliability, her experience with human intelligence operations making her naturally skeptical of information that seemed too convenient. But her questions were being answered with electronic intelligence that confirmed the human intelligence, creating a false sense of verification that the terrorists had carefully orchestrated. The meeting was moving toward its critical decision point. In approximately 3 minutes, Colonel Hartwell would call for a vote on Operation Silent Thunder. The 6 colonels would unanimously approve the mission based on intelligence they believed to be comprehensive and reliable. Special Operations Forces would be committed to an operation that would fail to prevent terrorist attacks and might actually accelerate the timeline by alerting the wrong targets. Sam checked her watch one final time, then reached into her jacket and touched the small badge pinned there. The weight of it seemed to have increased since she'd first put it on 18 months ago. What had begun as a symbol of elite selection had become a burden of knowledge and responsibility that sometimes felt almost unbearable. She thought about the terrorist leaders she'd met during her deep cover operation, their confidence in their ability to manipulate American intelligence systems, their certainty that American arrogance and bureaucratic thinking would prevent anyone from seeing through their deception. They were about to be proven wrong. The distinguished colonels in Conference Room Delta 7 were about to encounter an authority they hadn't expected and expertise they couldn't dismiss. The careful hierarchy of military rank was about to give way to the harsh reality of specialized knowledge and presidential-level authorization. The real briefing was about to begin. The moment of truth arrived with the soft click of the conference room door handle turning against the colonel's expectations. Major Samantha Rhodes had reached the point where retreat was impossible, where professional courtesy had been exhausted, and where the weight of national security demanded action that transcended normal military protocol. Her hand rested on the brushed steel handle of Conference Room Delta 7, and she could feel her heart rate remaining steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Inside the room, Colonel Hartwell had just clicked to the final slide of his presentation, a timeline for Operation Silent Thunder that showed Special Operations Forces deploying within 72 hours to neutralize what they believed to be an imminent terrorist threat. The 6 colonels were leaning forward in their chairs, the body language of experienced officers preparing to make a decision that would commit American lives and resources to a mission they believed would prevent attacks on American soil. "Gentlemen, ladies," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to the moment. "We have confirmation from multiple intelligence sources that this terrorist cell represents an immediate and credible threat to American interests. The weapons-grade plutonium has been confirmed through electronic intercepts, financial transaction analysis, and human intelligence reports. The timeline suggests they're preparing for deployment within the next 2 weeks." Colonel Webb nodded grimly, his thick fingers tapping against the classified briefing materials. "The target package is comprehensive, the intelligence is solid, and our special operations assets are positioned for immediate deployment. I don't see any reason for delay." Colonel Hayes adjusted her glasses and reviewed her analytical notes one final time. Pattern analysis confirms the threat assessment. Communication frequencies, financial flows, and logistical indicators all point toward imminent operational activity. From an Air Force intelligence perspective, this represents exactly the kind of threat profile we've been tracking for the past 18 months. Colonel Chun, drawing on his operational experience, voiced the question that had been nagging at him throughout the briefing. "My concern is the human intelligence component. We're relying heavily on sources we haven't had time to fully verify. In my experience, terrorist organizations are becoming increasingly sophisticated about feeding us disinformation." Colonel Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious. "I share that concern, David, but we've corroborated the human intelligence with electronic surveillance and financial analysis. When multiple intelligence disciplines point toward the same conclusion, we have to act on that information." Colonel Kane, representing naval intelligence, added his perspective. "Maritime surveillance confirms unusual shipping activity in the region, container movements that don't match normal commercial patterns. If they're moving materials by sea, the timeline becomes even more critical." The room fell silent as the 6 colonels absorbed the weight of their decision. Each had decades of experience, each had made similar decisions before, and each understood that the consequences of action, or inaction, could be measured in American lives. The intelligence seemed comprehensive, the threat appeared credible, and the operational parameters looked sound. Colonel Hartwell straightened, preparing to call for the formal vote that would set Operation Silent Thunder in motion. "Based on the intelligence presented and the threat assessment provided by our respective organizations, I'm prepared to recommend immediate approval of." The door opened. Not knocked, not requested, not announced through proper channels. Simply opened with the quiet confidence of someone who had every right to be there, despite having been explicitly excluded 15 minutes earlier. Major Samantha Rhodes stepped into Conference Room Delta 7 with the bearing of someone who belonged there, who had business there, who carried authority that transcended the normal protocols that had kept her in the hallway. Her expression was calm, professional, and utterly without deference to the rank structure that should have made her entry inappropriate. The 6 colonels turned toward the door with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation to outright anger. Colonel Hartwell's face flushed red as he processed the unprecedented breach of security protocols and meeting etiquette. His voice carried the sharp edge of authority challenged. Major Rhodes, I believe I made it clear that this briefing is classified above your authorization level. You need to leave immediately, or I'll have security escort you from the building. Colonel Webb's thick frame rose from his chair, his body language radiating the intimidation tactics that had served him well throughout his career. This is completely unacceptable. Junior officers don't interrupt classified briefings. I don't care what your assignment is or who sent you. Colonel Hayes removed her glasses with deliberate precision, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Sam with the kind of analytical intensity she normally reserved for enemy communications intercepts. Major, you're creating a security violation that could have serious consequences for your career. I strongly recommend you withdraw immediately and explain yourself through proper channels. Colonel Chun remained seated, but his compact frame was coiled with tension, ready to physically remove the intruder if necessary. His operational experience had taught him to assess threats quickly, and a junior officer who would violate security protocols raised immediate red flags about potential security breaches. Colonel Kane's weathered face showed the particular displeasure of someone whose decades of naval service had instilled absolute respect for chain of command and proper procedures. In 35 years of military service, I have never seen such a flagrant violation of protocol. This is grounds for court-martial. Colonel Martinez's expression was more analytical than angry, her human intelligence background making her curious about motivations rather than simply reacting to the breach. Something about the Major's calm confidence suggested this wasn't random insubordination or career suicide, but she couldn't identify what would justify such unprecedented behavior. Sam stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, allowing the full weight of their disapproval to register, letting them express their outrage and establish their positions. Her green eyes moved systematically from face to face, reading their reactions, assessing their personalities, calculating exactly how to proceed. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and carried an undertone that suggested she possessed information they needed to hear. Colonels, I understand your concern about protocol, and I apologize for the interruption. However, I have intelligence regarding Operation Silent Thunder that you need to hear before you vote. Colonel Hartwell's voice rose to match his indignation. Major, you don't have clearance for Operation Silent Thunder. You shouldn't even know that designation exists. This is a serious security breach, and you're going to answer for it. Sam's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a subtle straightening that suggested she was about to reveal information that would change the dynamic of the conversation. Sir, with respect, I think you'll find that my clearance level is higher than you've been led to believe. The 6 colonels exchanged glances, their anger beginning to mix with confusion. Junior officers didn't speak with such confidence unless they had something to back it up. But what could a major possibly possess that would justify interrupting a briefing of senior intelligence officials? Colonel Webb stepped forward, his intimidating presence designed to force submission. Major, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this ends now. Security. Sam raised her hand slightly, a gesture that was somehow both respectful and commanding. Before you call security, colonels, I think you should see this. She reached into her jacket with slow, deliberate movements that wouldn't trigger any defensive reactions, and withdrew a small leather credential case. Her movements were economical, precise, carrying the confidence of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what reaction it would produce. The room fell silent as 6 experienced intelligence officers watched a junior officer prepare to reveal credentials that she claimed would justify her unprecedented breach of protocol. The tension was palpable, the stakes were enormous, and everyone in the room understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether they were dealing with a career-ending security violation or something they hadn't anticipated. The challenge had been issued. The confrontation had reached its critical moment. Everything depended on what was in that leather case. Major Samantha Rhodes held the leather credential case with the steady confidence of someone who had carried this weight before, who understood exactly what she was about to reveal and the seismic shift it would create in the room. The small case seemed insignificant in her hands, ordinary black leather, worn smooth by handling, no larger than a standard military ID holder. But the 6 colonels found themselves staring at it with the intensity of people who sensed that something fundamental was about to change. Sam's voice carried no trace of apology or uncertainty as she began to speak. Colonels, 18 months ago, I was recruited into a specialized intelligence unit that operates under direct presidential authorization. What you're about to see represents authority that supersedes normal military hierarchy when immediate national security interests are at stake. She opened the credential case with deliberate precision, revealing a badge that none of them had seen before but all of them instinctively recognized as significant. The shield was silver and blue enamel, featuring an eagle with wings spread over a globe, surrounded by 13 stars. Below the eagle, in small but clear lettering, were the words Joint Special Operations Command Intelligence Support Activity. At the bottom, in even smaller script, Presidential Authorization Required. But it wasn't just the badge that commanded attention. It was the identification card visible through the clear plastic window opposite the badge. Sam's photograph, her name, her rank. But below that, security clearance codes that made Colonel Hayes draw a sharp breath and access authorizations that caused Colonel Martinez to lean forward with sudden understanding. My name is Major Samantha Rhodes, serial number 456-78-9012. Currently assigned to JSOC-ISA under Presidential Finding 2023-7. Sam continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I hold TS/SCI clearance with Cosmic Crypto Access and Presidential-level Special Access Program authorizations. More importantly for this discussion, I have just returned from an 18-month deep cover operation in Pakistan and Afghanistan that directly relates to the intelligence you're using to plan Operation Silent Thunder. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of air conditioning and the barely audible hum of electronic surveillance equipment. 6 of America's most experienced intelligence officers found themselves confronting a reality that challenged every assumption they'd made about the young major they'd dismissed 15 minutes earlier. Colonel Hartwell was the first to find his voice, though it carried none of the authority it had held moments before. JSOC-ISA. I've heard rumors about that unit, but I've never seen operational confirmation of its existence. Sam's expression remained professional but allowed a slight smile. That's intentional, sir. The unit operates in the spaces between official intelligence organizations, with authority to bypass normal channels when time-sensitive national security issues are at stake. My credentials can be verified through NSC channels, but I suspect you'll find that the verification process would take longer than we have available. Colonel Webb's thick frame had gone very still, his intimidating posture replaced by the careful attention of someone who realized he might have made a serious error in judgment. Presidential authorization. That would put you outside normal military hierarchy. But why wasn't this communicated through proper channels? Because proper channels take time, sir, and we don't have time, Sam replied, closing the credential case but keeping it visible in her hand. The intelligence you're using to plan Operation Silent Thunder has been compromised. Worse than compromised. It's been deliberately crafted by the very terrorist network you're hoping to neutralize. Colonel Chun leaned forward, his operational experience making him immediately alert to the implications. You're saying we have bad intelligence? How do you know this? Sam's voice took on the particular tone of someone who had lived through the events she was describing. Because I was present when the deception was planned. I spent 6 weeks in a Taliban-controlled compound in northern Pakistan, operating under deep cover as part of a joint CIA Special Operations Task Force. I was in the room when terrorist leaders discussed their strategy for misdirecting American intelligence efforts. She paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. The compound you're planning to hit was abandoned 6 weeks ago. The satellite imagery showing recent activity is staged. The communications intercepts confirming weapons movement are deliberate transmissions designed to be intercepted. The human intelligence sources confirming the threat are either compromised or fabricated. Colonel Hayes removed her glasses completely, her analytical mind racing through the implications. If what you're saying is true, then Operation Silent Thunder would not only fail to neutralize the threat, it would actually serve their strategic objectives. Exactly, Sam confirmed. While our special operations forces are committed to a worthless target in Afghanistan, the real terrorist network is finalizing preparations for attacks on American soil. The weapons-grade plutonium isn't in Central Asia, it's already in the continental United States, distributed to sleeper cells in major cities. Colonel Martinez, drawing on her human intelligence experience, asked the critical question. How do we verify this? How do we know your intelligence is more reliable than the sources we've been using? Sam reached into her briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing classification markings that made several colonels sit up straighter. These are copies of communications intercepts and photographic intelligence gathered during my deep cover operation. Names, dates, locations, financial transaction records, and operational timelines for the actual terrorist network. She placed the envelope on the conference table with deliberate precision. You'll also find verification codes that will allow you to confirm my operational history and the validity of my intelligence through NSC and CIA channels. But I need to warn you, making those calls will take hours we don't have. Colonel Kane spoke for the first time since Sam had entered the room, his weathered face showing the particular concern of someone who understood maritime security implications. If there are sleeper cells already in position in American cities, the timeline changes completely. We're not looking at preventing a future attack. We're looking at stopping an operation already in progress. Sam nodded grimly. The attacks are scheduled for simultaneous execution in 72 hours. New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. Dirty bombs detonated during morning rush hour in each city. The casualty estimates. She paused, her voice showing the weight of the knowledge she carried. Conservative estimates suggest over 200,000 immediate deaths, with radiological contamination making large sections of each city uninhabitable for decades. The room erupted in controlled chaos as 6 experienced officers began processing the magnitude of what they were hearing. Cell phones appeared as colonels prepared to make verification calls to their respective headquarters. Laptops opened as analysts began cross-referencing the intelligence Sam had provided with their existing databases. But Sam raised her hand again, commanding attention with a gesture that carried far more authority than her major's oak leaves should have provided. Colonels, before you make those calls, you need to understand something. The verification process will alert multiple intelligence organizations to the existence of my operation and the intelligence I've gathered. Some of those organizations have been penetrated by the very network we're trying to stop. Colonel Hartwell looked up from his phone, his expression showing the particular stress of someone who realized he was facing a decision with no good options. You're asking us to commit American lives and resources based on intelligence we can't verify through normal channels, provided by an officer whose very existence in our intelligence apparatus appears to be classified above our authorization levels. Sam's green eyes met his steadily. Sir, I'm asking you to trust intelligence gathered at considerable personal risk by someone who has spent 18 months living among the people who want to kill Americans. I'm asking you to consider that the enemy might be smart enough to feed us exactly the kind of intelligence we expect to receive, through exactly the channels we trust. She gestured toward the envelope on the table. Everything you need to verify my intelligence is in there. Names, dates, locations, financial records, communications intercepts. But verification takes time, and time is the one resource we don't have. The 6 colonels found themselves facing a decision that would define their careers and potentially determine whether American cities would wake up to radiological attacks in 72 hours. Trust intelligence from official channels that confirmed their operational assumptions, or trust intelligence from a source they couldn't verify through normal means that suggested everything they believed was wrong. The warning had been given. The stakes had been defined. Now they had to choose. The transformation in Conference Room Delta 7 was immediate and electric as 6 veteran intelligence officers began to grasp the full implications of what Major Samantha Rhodes had just revealed. The atmosphere shifted from bureaucratic certainty to operational urgency as each colonel processed the intelligence through the lens of their specialized expertise. Their decades of experience suddenly focused on a threat matrix that had inverted everything they thought they knew. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel Patricia Hayes was the first to act, her analytical mind immediately shifting into crisis mode. She opened her secure laptop and began cross-referencing the intelligence code Sam had provided with classified databases that most officers would never access. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years extracting actionable intelligence from massive datasets. "The access codes are legitimate," Hayes announced after 30 seconds of rapid typing. "NSC authentication confirms. JSOCISA is real, and Major Rhodes's clearance level is significantly higher than anything I've seen outside of presidential briefing materials." Colonel David Chun leaned across the table, his operational experience making him focus on immediate tactical implications rather than bureaucratic verification. "Major, if sleeper cells are already in position in 5 major cities, we need specifics. Locations, cell composition, operational timelines. What exactly are we looking at in terms of immediate response requirements?" Sam opened her briefcase again and withdrew a series of classified folders, each bearing the distinctive red stripes that indicated special access program materials. The New York cell is operating from a warehouse in Queens, disguised as an import business specializing in Middle Eastern carpets. 3 operatives, led by someone with extensive technical training in radiological dispersal devices. They received the weapons-grade plutonium 6 days ago, via shipping container through the port of Newark. She handed the first folder to Chun, who opened it and immediately began studying satellite photographs and surveillance reports that showed levels of detail that clearly indicated months of careful intelligence gathering. The Washington cell is based in Alexandria, using a legitimate electronics repair shop as cover. 2 operatives, but they have access to local assets who don't know they're supporting a terrorist operation. Colonel Marcus Webb's thick fingers drummed against the table as he processed the operational complexities. 5 simultaneous operations across multiple time zones, coordinated execution during rush hour. This isn't just terrorism. This is strategic warfare designed to cripple American infrastructure and government continuity. Sam nodded grimly. The psychological impact is as important as the immediate casualties. 5 American cities hit simultaneously with radiological weapons would fundamentally alter public perception of government security capabilities. The economic disruption alone would take decades to recover from. Colonel Robert Kane focused on the maritime intelligence implications, his naval background making him immediately concerned about how the materials had entered the country undetected. "Major, you mentioned shipping containers through Newark. Are we looking at a compromised port security situation? Or did they use legitimate commercial channels?" "Legitimate channels," Sam replied, handing him a folder containing shipping manifests and customs documentation. The containers were declared as carrying industrial equipment for a construction company that exists on paper but has no actual operations. The paperwork was perfect, the company had established credit and business relationships, and the plutonium was shielded in ways that defeated standard radiation detection equipment. Colonel Lisa Martinez opened the folder Sam had handed her and found herself staring at photographs that clearly showed the interior of terrorist safe houses, detailed financial records, and communications intercepts that provided an intimate look at operational planning. This level of human intelligence. "Major, how did you maintain cover for 18 months? Some of these photographs show you were present during operational planning meetings." Sam's expression remained professional, but something in her eyes suggested the personal cost of her deep cover work. "The unit specializes in long-term infiltration operations. I was inserted into the network through a carefully constructed legend that took 2 years to establish. As far as the terrorist leadership knows, I'm a radicalized American convert who proved her commitment through several smaller operations." She paused, her voice taking on the particular tone of someone who had lived through experiences that would mark her permanently. Maintaining cover meant participating in activities that, let's just say the psychological evaluations when I returned required extensive counseling and will continue for the foreseeable future. Colonel Hartwell found himself staring at intelligence that was more comprehensive and detailed than anything his organization had produced in months of conventional surveillance and analysis. "Major, assuming we accept your intelligence as accurate, what are you recommending in terms of immediate response? We can't simply abort Operation Silent Thunder and redirect our special operations assets without alerting the terrorist network. Sam reached into her briefcase one final time and withdrew a thick operations folder with presidential seal authentication visible on the cover. I've prepared a comprehensive response plan that addresses simultaneous neutralization of all 5 cells while maintaining operational security. The plan requires coordination between FBI hostage rescue teams, local SWAT units, bomb disposal experts, and intelligence assets already in position. She opened the folder to reveal detailed floor plans, personnel assessments, tactical recommendations, and timeline coordination that demonstrated months of careful preparation. The operations need to be executed simultaneously across all 5 cities, with zero communication between sites until all cells are neutralized. Any delay or compromise in one location could trigger early detonation in the others. Colonel Chun studied the tactical plans with growing respect. This isn't theoretical planning. These are operational orders based on detailed surveillance and intelligence gathering. How long have you been developing this response? 6 weeks, Sam replied, since I confirmed that the terrorist network was moving to execution phase. I've been working with FBI and local law enforcement to position assets and develop tactical approaches that would allow simultaneous neutralization without alerting the network. Colonel Hayes looked up from her laptop, her face showing the particular strain of someone who had been cross-referencing intelligence at maximum speed. Major, I verified your operational history through NSC channels. Your success rate is unprecedented. Every operation you've been involved with has resulted in either prevention of terrorist attacks or elimination of high-value targets. Colonel Martinez leaned forward, her human intelligence experience making her focus on the broader implications. If we execute this plan, if we neutralize these 5 cells, what happens to your cover? Are there other terrorist networks you're monitoring that would be compromised? Sam's expression grew somber. My cover will be blown the moment we move on these cells. 18 months of deep infiltration ends the moment FBI teams hit those safe houses. But the alternative is radiological attacks on 5 American cities, and that's not acceptable. The room fell silent as 6 veteran intelligence officers absorbed the magnitude of the decision they were facing. Not just the operational implications, but the personal sacrifice being made by someone who had spent 18 months living among enemies, gathering intelligence that could prevent attacks on American soil, knowing that using that intelligence would end her ability to continue gathering it. Colonel Webb spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the personal costs of intelligence work. Major, what you're describing, ending an 18-month operation that took years to establish, that's not just career sacrifice, that's potentially life-threatening. These people will know you betrayed them. Sam nodded slowly. The unit has extraction protocols and witness protection capabilities. I'll survive physically. But yes, this ends my ability to operate in this theater, probably permanently. The networks I've infiltrated will adapt their security procedures based on what they learn from this compromise. Colonel Kane studied the maritime intelligence Sam had provided, his weathered face showing growing concern. Major, if they successfully smuggled weapons-grade plutonium through one of our major ports without detection, what else might they have brought in? Are we looking at additional weapons, additional cells, additional threats? That's why timing is critical, Sam replied. The intelligence I gathered suggests this is their primary operation, but there are indicators of follow-up attacks planned if this one succeeds. Neutralizing these 5 cells might prevent not just immediate attacks, but a broader campaign designed to fundamentally destabilize American security. Colonel Hartwell looked around the table at his colleagues, reading their expressions, understanding that they had reached the moment where theoretical analysis gave way to operational decision-making. Colleagues, we have intelligence that contradicts our existing threat assessment, provided by a source whose credentials appear legitimate, but whose very existence challenges normal verification procedures. The stakes couldn't be higher. The demonstration phase was complete. The intelligence had been presented, the credentials verified, the operational plans detailed. 6 experienced officers who had dismissed a young major 15 minutes earlier now found themselves confronting expertise and authority they hadn't anticipated. Information that demanded action they weren't prepared for. The real test was about to begin. The final test of credibility came from the most unlikely source, Colonel James Hartwell himself, the same officer who had dismissed Sam from the room 20 minutes earlier. His decades of experience and institutional authority made him the ultimate arbiter of whether her intelligence would be accepted or rejected by the Pentagon's senior leadership. The weight of his decision would determine not just the fate of Operation Silent Thunder, but potentially the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Hartwell stood slowly, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light as he moved around the conference table with deliberate precision. His eyes never left Sam's face as he approached, searching for any sign of deception, any indication that the extraordinary claims she'd made might be elaborate fabrication or psychological manipulation. At 58, he had interrogated enemy agents, debriefed defectors, and evaluated intelligence from sources whose reliability often meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Major Rhodes," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who understood that his next words would shape everything that followed. "In 36 years of military service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this. An officer I dismissed from a classified briefing returns with credentials I cannot fully verify through normal channels, carrying intelligence that contradicts months of careful analysis by multiple intelligence organizations." Sam remained at attention, her green eyes meeting his steadily. She understood that this moment represented more than professional evaluation. It was a test of whether institutional hierarchy could adapt quickly enough to accommodate unconventional expertise when national security hung in the balance. Hartwell continued his slow circuit around the table, his hands clasped behind his back in the classic posture of a senior officer wrestling with momentous decisions. "The intelligence you've presented is extraordinarily detailed, operationally specific, and internally consistent. The credentials you've shown appear legitimate, though they represent authority structures I was not aware existed at this level." He stopped directly in front of Sam, close enough that she could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed decades of institutional experience against the possibility that everything he thought he knew about the current threat was wrong. "But credentials can be forged, intelligence can be fabricated, and even legitimate sources can be turned or compromised. Before I recommend that this organization commit to a complete reversal of our operational priorities based on your intelligence, I need something more." Sam nodded slowly, understanding that Hartwell was not being obstructionist but appropriately cautious. "Sir, what would you need to see to convince you that my intelligence is accurate?" Hartwell's expression grew even more serious. "I need you to demonstrate knowledge that only someone with genuine access to terrorist operational planning could possess. Details that couldn't be obtained through conventional intelligence gathering, information that would be impossible to fabricate convincingly." Without hesitation, Sam reached into her briefcase and withdrew a small digital recording device. "Colonel, during my final week in the terrorist compound, I was present for a planning session where the cell leaders discussed specific details about American security procedures that they had learned through previous reconnaissance operations." She placed the device on the conference table and pressed play. The room filled with voices speaking in Arabic, the conversation clearly recorded in an informal setting where the speakers believed they were secure from surveillance. Sam provided translation as the recording played. "The first voice you're hearing is Hassan al-Mahmoud, the operational commander for the New York cell. He's describing security procedures at the Federal Reserve building that he observed during 3 separate reconnaissance visits in 2023. He's specifically discussing the rotation schedule for armed guards and the timing of armored car deliveries." Colonel Chun leaned forward, his operational experience making him immediately alert to the implications. "Major, how could they have that information? Federal Reserve security procedures are classified, and the guard rotation schedules change frequently. Because they conducted extensive surveillance operations over an 18-month period," Sam replied as the recording continued. "They photographed guard positions, timed patrols, and documented armored car schedules. But more importantly, they recruited a cleaning contractor who had access to service areas and could observe security procedures firsthand." The recording continued, and Sam translated another segment. "Now you're hearing Rashid Al-Hamza, who leads the Washington cell. He's describing the specific type of radiation detection equipment used at the Capitol building security checkpoints, including the model numbers and sensitivity thresholds. Colonel Kane's weathered face showed deep concern. That information would be impossible to obtain without either extensive technical surveillance or inside access to Department of Homeland Security briefing materials. Sam nodded grimly. They obtained it through a combination of both. Technical surveillance of security installations and recruitment of contract workers who had access to sensitive areas. The recording includes discussions of at least 12 separate reconnaissance operations conducted in all 5 target cities. She fast-forwarded the recording to another section. This next segment discusses something that will be particularly relevant to your verification process. They're talking about American intelligence operations they've detected, including specific references to surveillance activities your organizations have been conducting. The voice on the recording spoke in rapid Arabic, and Sam's translation sent a chill through the room. Al-Mahmoud is describing how they identified American surveillance teams in Karachi and Islamabad. He's providing specific details about vehicle types, personnel descriptions, and operational patterns that allowed them to avoid detection. Colonel Martinez's face went pale as she realized the implications. If they could identify our surveillance operations, they could have fed false information through channels specifically designed to be intercepted. Exactly, Sam confirmed. The next part of the recording discusses their strategy for providing disinformation through compromised sources. They're laughing about how American intelligence analysts are predictably arrogant and will accept information that confirms their existing assumptions. She stopped the recording and looked around the table at 6 faces that showed varying degrees of shock, anger, and grudging respect. Colonel Hartwell, that recording contains over 4 hours of operational planning discussions, including details about American security procedures that could only be obtained through extensive reconnaissance, specific information about intelligence operations that your organizations believed were secure, and tactical discussions about coordinating attacks on American soil. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the intelligence but the implications for how thoroughly American security assumptions had been compromised. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just realized that his most fundamental beliefs about operational security might be wrong. Major, assuming this recording is genuine, it suggests not just that our current intelligence is wrong, but that our intelligence gathering methods have been systematically compromised. They knew we were watching, they knew how we were watching, and they used that knowledge to feed us exactly the information they wanted us to have. Sam nodded. Sir, the sophistication of their deception operations exceeds anything we've encountered before. They didn't just avoid our surveillance. They turned it into a weapon against us by using our own intelligence gathering procedures to deliver false information through channels we trusted. Colonel Webb's thick frame had gone very still as he absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. If they could compromise our intelligence gathering to this extent, if they could conduct 18 months of reconnaissance in American cities without detection, what else don't we know about their capabilities? That's why immediate action is critical, Sam replied. The recording includes references to additional operations planned for future execution if the initial attacks succeed. This isn't just about preventing 5 radiological attacks. It's about preventing a broader campaign designed to fundamentally undermine American security infrastructure. Colonel Hayes looked up from her laptop, where she had been frantically cross-referencing the details Sam had provided with classified intelligence databases. Major, I've been checking the reconnaissance details you've described against incident reports from Federal Protective Service and Capitol Police. They match. We have documentation of suspicious activities at all 5 target locations that correlates exactly with the surveillance operations described in your recording. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Not only was Sam's intelligence accurate, but it explained suspicious activities that American security services had noted, but not connected to a broader operational pattern. The terrorist reconnaissance had been detected but not understood, creating a failure of analysis that had allowed the plot to advance undetected. Hartwell walked back to his position at the head of the table, his expression showing the particular gravity of someone who had just realized that everything he thought he knew about the current threat environment was wrong. Major Rhodes, based on the intelligence you've presented, the credentials you've shown, and the verification we've been able to conduct, I am prepared to recommend immediate suspension of Operation Silent Thunder and implementation of your counterterrorism response plan. He paused, looking around the table at his colleagues. But I need unanimous agreement from this council. We are recommending a complete reversal of Pentagon intelligence priorities based on the word of an officer whose very existence in our command structure was unknown to us 1 hour ago. The professional and personal consequences of this decision, if we are wrong, would be catastrophic for all of us. Sam understood that this was the moment of ultimate test. 6 veteran intelligence officers who had spent decades building careers on careful analysis and institutional procedures were being asked to abandon months of work and commit to an operation based on intelligence they couldn't verify through normal channels. The institutional hierarchy that had initially excluded her from the room was now the only thing that could authorize the action necessary to prevent the attacks she had discovered. Everything depended on their willingness to trust expertise over rank, intelligence over assumption, and urgent necessity over comfortable procedure. The final decision was about to be made. The teaching moment that followed would reshape how American intelligence services understood the intersection of institutional authority and operational necessity. Major Samantha Rhodes stood before 6 of the Pentagon's most senior intelligence officers, no longer the dismissed junior officer they had encountered an hour earlier, but a combat-tested professional whose expertise had just proven more valuable than their combined decades of conventional analysis. The transformation in the room's dynamic was complete and irreversible. Colonel Hartwell had moved from dismissal to grudging acceptance to full operational commitment, but the deeper implications of what had just occurred were still settling into the consciousness of everyone present. This wasn't just about one intelligence operation or one terrorist threat. It was about how American security institutions needed to evolve to meet asymmetric challenges that didn't conform to traditional patterns. Sam understood that her next words would determine not just the immediate operational response, but how these 6 officers would approach similar situations throughout the remainder of their careers. The lesson couldn't be about her individual capabilities or the specific details of her deep cover operation. It needed to be about the fundamental principles that had allowed this near-catastrophic intelligence failure to occur. "Colonels," she began, her voice carrying the authority she had earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited through rank. "What happened in this room over the past hour represents a systemic vulnerability that extends far beyond Operation Silent Thunder or this specific terrorist threat. I want to talk about why this situation developed and how we prevent it from happening again." She moved to the wall-mounted display screen and activated the presentation system, calling up a simple organizational chart that showed the traditional hierarchy of American military intelligence. Our intelligence infrastructure was designed during the Cold War to fight enemies who operated according to recognizable patterns. State actors with conventional military structures, communication systems we could intercept, and operational methods that matched our analytical frameworks. Colonel Chun leaned forward, his operational experience making him immediately receptive to lessons about adapting to evolving threats. "Major, what you're describing sounds like the adaptation challenges we faced throughout the global war on terror. But this situation seems different in scope." Sam nodded, clicking to the next slide, which showed a network diagram representing modern terrorist organizations. "The difference is that our enemies have learned to exploit not just our technological vulnerabilities, but our cognitive and institutional vulnerabilities. They understand how we think, how we analyze information, and how we make decisions." She highlighted specific nodes on the network diagram. The terrorist leadership that planned these attacks spent 2 years studying American intelligence procedures before implementing their deception campaign. They analyzed our communication intercept capabilities, our financial transaction monitoring systems, and our human intelligence recruitment patterns. Colonel Martinez, drawing on her extensive human intelligence experience, asked the critical question. "Are you saying they designed their deception specifically to exploit our analytical assumptions?" "Exactly," Sam confirmed, clicking to a slide that showed parallel timelines, one representing actual terrorist activities and another showing the false intelligence fed to American agencies. They provided information through channels they knew we monitored, using communication patterns they knew we would interpret as genuine, confirming threat assessments they knew we wanted to believe. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. But the real vulnerability wasn't technological or procedural. It was cultural. They understood that American intelligence organizations would discount information that challenged established assumptions, especially when that information came from sources that didn't match our expectations about authority and expertise. Colonel Hayes removed her glasses and studied the timeline display with growing understanding. You're talking about confirmation bias on an institutional level. We accepted intelligence that supported our existing threat assessment and unconsciously filtered out contradictory information. Sam advanced to the next slide, showing a photograph of the terrorist compound in Pakistan where she had spent 6 weeks gathering intelligence. When I first returned from my deep cover operation and attempted to brief my immediate supervisors about the deception campaign, my intelligence was questioned not because it was inaccurate, but because it contradicted months of analysis by senior officials. Colonel Webb's thick frame shifted in his chair as he processed the uncomfortable implications. You're saying the same institutional hierarchy that gives us operational effectiveness also creates blind spots that enemies can exploit? Institutional hierarchy serves critical functions, Sam replied carefully, but it can become counterproductive when rank is confused with expertise, when seniority is assumed to equal insight, or when challenging established assumptions is seen as insubordination rather than analytical rigor. She clicked to a slide showing casualty projections for the 5 planned attacks. If we had proceeded with Operation Silent Thunder based on the compromised intelligence, the result would have been more than 200,000 American deaths and radiological contamination of 5 major cities. The institutional factors that nearly prevented this briefing from occurring represent a vulnerability that enemies will continue to exploit. Colonel Kane spoke for the first time in several minutes, his weathered face showing the particular concern of someone who understood maritime security implications. Major, what you're describing suggests that our enemies understand our decision-making processes better than we do ourselves. Sam nodded grimly. Modern terrorist organizations employ sophisticated psychological operations designed to manipulate our institutional responses. They study our leadership structures, our analytical methods, and our cultural assumptions about authority and credibility. She advanced to a slide showing recommended changes to intelligence evaluation procedures. The countermeasures aren't complicated conceptually, but they require cultural adaptation that challenges fundamental assumptions about how military organizations should operate. Colonel Hartwell studied the recommendations with the attention of someone who understood that his own career had been shaped by the institutional patterns Sam was describing. What specific changes are you recommending? Sam highlighted key points on the slide. First, intelligence evaluation procedures that prioritize source credibility and information accuracy over the rank or institutional position of the person providing the intelligence. Second, systematic red team analysis that specifically looks for ways enemies might exploit our analytical assumptions. Third, rapid verification procedures for intelligence that contradicts established threat assessments. She clicked to the final slide, showing a modified organizational chart that included direct communication channels between operational intelligence officers and senior decision-makers. Most importantly, we need institutional mechanisms that allow unconventional expertise to reach decision-makers without being filtered through hierarchies that might discount it. Colonel Martinez leaned back in her chair, her expression showing the particular strain of someone whose fundamental assumptions about professional practice were being challenged. Major, what you're describing would represent a significant departure from traditional military culture. The chain of command exists for reasons that go beyond bureaucratic convenience. Sam's response was measured but firm. I'm not recommending abandonment of military hierarchy. I'm recommending adaptation that allows hierarchy to serve its essential functions while minimizing the cognitive vulnerabilities that enemies have learned to exploit. She turned off the presentation system and faced the 6 colonels directly. Every officer in this room has decades more experience than I do. Every officer in this room has earned their position through demonstrated competence and professional excellence. But experience and competence in conventional operations doesn't automatically translate to expertise in unconventional threats. The silence that followed was profound as 6 veteran officers processed not just the immediate operational implications, but the broader challenge to institutional practices they had spent their careers mastering and defending. Colonel Hartwell spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just recognized fundamental gaps in his own understanding. Major, the changes you're describing would require more than procedural modifications. They would require cultural evolution in organizations that have succeeded for decades using traditional methods. Sam nodded. Sir, institutional culture evolved to meet the threats of previous conflicts. Modern adversaries have adapted their methods to exploit our institutional culture. Our response needs to be equally adaptive. She paused, looking around the table at faces that showed varying degrees of acceptance, concern, and intellectual challenge. The alternative is continued vulnerability to enemies who understand our decision-making processes better than we understand their operational methods. The teaching moment was complete. 6 senior intelligence officers who had entered the room confident in their analytical methods and institutional procedures now faced the uncomfortable reality that their most fundamental assumptions about expertise and authority might be exploited by adversaries who had studied American decision-making more carefully than Americans had studied their own institutional vulnerabilities. The real education was just beginning. The real-world validation of Major Samantha Rhodes's intelligence came not in a Pentagon briefing room, but in the coordinated execution of the most complex counterterrorism operation in American domestic history. At exactly 0547 hours Eastern Standard Time, FBI hostage rescue teams, local SWAT units, and specialized bomb disposal experts moved simultaneously against terrorist cells in 5 American cities. Their actions synchronized across multiple time zones with precision that would have been impossible without the detailed intelligence Sam had gathered during her 18 months of deep cover infiltration. The operation, designated Broken Arrow by the Joint Task Force coordinating the response, represented everything Sam had warned the colonels about: the difference between theoretical planning and operational reality, the gap between intelligence assumptions and ground truth, and the critical importance of human intelligence in understanding enemy capabilities that electronic surveillance could never detect. In New York City, FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez led a 12-person team through the pre-dawn darkness toward a warehouse in Queens that had been masquerading as a carpet import business for over 8 months. The intelligence Sam had provided included detailed floor plans, guard schedules, and even the specific locations where the weapons-grade plutonium had been stored. Martinez's team moved with the confidence that came from knowing exactly what they would find and where they would find it. The warehouse appeared exactly as Sam had described: ordinary commercial building with reinforced security doors and surveillance cameras that seemed appropriate for a legitimate import business. But the intelligence package included details that only someone with inside access could have known: the locations of hidden weapons caches, the existence of a secondary exit through an adjacent building, and the fact that the main storage area contained not just radiological materials but a fully assembled dirty bomb ready for transport. Martinez positioned her team according to the tactical recommendations Sam had developed, coordinating the breach to neutralize all 3 terrorists simultaneously while preventing any possibility of triggering the radiological device. The operation took exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds from initial breach to complete facility security. No shots were fired, no American personnel were injured, and the dirty bomb was secured without any release of radioactive material. 2,000 miles away in Chicago, Detective Lieutenant James Crawford was leading a joint task force through an abandoned manufacturing facility where intelligence indicated the Midwest cell had been assembling their radiological dispersal device. Crawford, a 20-year veteran of Chicago PD's SWAT team, had initially been skeptical of intelligence provided by what appeared to be a junior military officer with no local law enforcement experience. But the intelligence package Sam had provided included photographs of the facility's interior, detailed descriptions of the terrorist security procedures, and specific warnings about improvised explosive devices that had been placed to prevent exactly the kind of raid Crawford was conducting. Her warnings about the IEDs had been precise enough to include locations, trigger mechanisms, and even the specific types of explosives used. Crawford's team found the facility exactly as described, including the IEDs positioned in locations that would have killed several officers if Sam's intelligence hadn't identified them. The 2 terrorists inside surrendered without resistance when faced with overwhelming tactical superiority and the clear indication that their security had been completely compromised. The radiological materials were secured, and the facility was cleared without incident. In Washington, D.C., FBI Assistant Director Thomas Kellerman was personally overseeing the operation against what intelligence suggested was the most dangerous of the 5 cells, the one closest to potential government targets, and the one with the most sophisticated technical capabilities. Kellerman had spent his career in counterterrorism operations, but he had never worked with intelligence as detailed and operationally specific as what Sam had provided. The electronics repair shop in Alexandria that served as the cell's front operation looked innocuous from the outside, but Sam's intelligence had revealed the existence of a sophisticated laboratory in the basement where the terrorists had been refining weapons-grade plutonium and testing dispersal mechanisms. Her intelligence included detailed descriptions of the laboratory equipment, the location of security cameras, and even the daily schedules of the two primary terrorists. Kellerman's team executed the raid with surgical precision, neutralizing both terrorists and securing the laboratory before any materials could be destroyed or weaponized. The basement facility contained evidence of months of preparation, including test results showing that the terrorists had successfully developed a radiological dispersal device capable of contaminating several city blocks with lethal levels of radiation. On the West Coast, Los Angeles Police Department Captain Sarah Chun was leading a joint task force against a cell operating from what appeared to be a legitimate construction company. Chun had worked gang enforcement for 15 years and thought she understood urban criminal operations. But the intelligence Sam had provided revealed a level of operational sophistication that exceeded anything she had encountered in domestic law enforcement. The construction company had been used as cover for months of reconnaissance operations against potential targets throughout Los Angeles, including detailed surveillance of security procedures at federal buildings, major transportation hubs, and critical infrastructure facilities. Sam's intelligence had identified not just the location of the radiological materials, but also detailed plans for coordinating the attack with simultaneous strikes against local emergency response capabilities. Chen's team found extensive documentation of the surveillance operations, including photographs and detailed notes about security procedures that could only have been gathered through months of careful observation. The single terrorist at the Los Angeles location was taken into custody without incident, and the radiological materials were secured before any assembly into a functional weapon could be completed. In Atlanta, the final piece of the coordinated operation unfolded as Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents moved against what intelligence suggested was the command and control center for the entire multi-city operation. Special Agent David Rodriguez had initially questioned whether the level of coordination Sam had described was possible for a terrorist network, but the evidence secured in Atlanta confirmed that the plot represented unprecedented operational sophistication. The Atlanta facility contained communications equipment linking all 5 cells, detailed operational timelines showing that the attacks had been scheduled for simultaneous execution during morning rush hour, and contingency plans for follow-up attacks if the initial operations had succeeded. The evidence confirmed everything Sam had warned the Pentagon colonels about. This wasn't just terrorism, but strategic warfare designed to fundamentally destabilize American security infrastructure. The success of Operation Broken Arrow validated every aspect of Sam's intelligence and vindicated the decision by 6 Pentagon colonels to trust unconventional expertise over institutional assumptions. More than 200,000 American lives had been saved, 5 major cities had avoided radiological contamination, and a sophisticated terrorist network had been completely dismantled. But the operation's success also confirmed the broader lessons Sam had tried to teach about intelligence failures and institutional vulnerabilities. Every aspect of the traditional intelligence analysis that had supported Operation Silent Thunder had been wrong, not through analytical failure, but through systematic deception that exploited American assumptions about how terrorist networks operated and how intelligence should be gathered and evaluated. The coordinated arrests in 5 cities occurred without any communication between the cells, confirming that the terrorist network had been compartmentalized in exactly the way Sam had described. The weapons-grade plutonium had indeed been distributed to sleeper cells already in position, confirming that the timeline for attack had been much shorter than conventional intelligence had suggested. Most importantly, the evidence secured during the raids confirmed that American intelligence gathering methods had been systematically compromised, that terrorist organizations had developed sophisticated capabilities for providing false information through channels American analysts trusted, and that institutional assumptions about expertise and authority had created vulnerabilities that enemies had learned to exploit. The real-world validation was complete. The theory had become practice, the warnings had proven accurate, and the intelligence that 6 colonels had initially dismissed had prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. The mission had succeeded, but the broader implications were just beginning to be understood. The recognition that followed Operation Broken Arrow fundamentally transformed how American intelligence services understood the relationship between institutional authority and operational effectiveness. In the secure conference room of the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, the same 6 colonels who had initially dismissed Major Samantha Rhodes now found themselves participating in the most comprehensive review of intelligence failures and institutional vulnerabilities in decades. The after-action briefing took place 72 hours after the successful raids, with additional participants from CIA, FBI, NSA, and the National Security Council staff. The room buzzed with the particular energy that followed major operational successes, but underneath the satisfaction of prevented catastrophe lay deeper questions about how such a massive intelligence failure had nearly occurred. Colonel James Hartwell stood at the front of the room, but the dynamics had shifted completely from the original briefing. Sam sat at the main table as the primary briefer, her temporary promotion to lieutenant colonel having been expedited through channels that most of the participants didn't know existed. The transformation was more than cosmetic. It represented institutional acknowledgement that expertise and authority didn't always align with traditional hierarchical expectations. Ladies and gentlemen, Hartwell began, the purpose of this review is not to assign blame for intelligence failures, but to understand systemic vulnerabilities that allowed a sophisticated terrorist network to operate undetected on American soil for 18 months, while feeding false information to multiple intelligence organizations. He gestured to Sam, who had prepared a comprehensive analysis of how the deception campaign had exploited American institutional assumptions. Lieutenant Colonel Rhodes will brief us on the methodologies used by the terrorist network to compromise our intelligence gathering and analysis procedures. Sam stood and activated the presentation system, displaying a complex diagram that showed the intersection of terrorist operational security and American intelligence vulnerabilities. The key to understanding this operation is recognizing that it was designed not just to avoid American surveillance, but to actively manipulate American decision-making processes. She clicked to the next slide, showing parallel timelines of actual terrorist activities and the false intelligence fed to American agencies. The terrorist leadership studied American intelligence procedures for 2 years before implementing their deception campaign. They analyzed our communication intercept capabilities, our financial monitoring systems, our human intelligence recruitment patterns, and most importantly, our analytical assumptions about how terrorist networks operate. Director Patricia Vance from the CIA leaned forward, her expression showing the particular concern of someone whose organization had been specifically targeted by the deception. Lieutenant Colonel, are you saying they designed false intelligence specifically to exploit our analytical biases? Exactly, Sam confirmed. They provided information that confirmed existing American assumptions about terrorist capabilities, operational timelines, and geographic focus. They fed us intelligence that made us feel smart for intercepting it, while the real operation proceeded in directions we weren't monitoring. She advanced to a slide showing intercepted communications that had been deliberately transmitted for American collection. Every piece of electronic intelligence supporting Operation Silent Thunder was carefully crafted to be intercepted. The terrorists used communication methods they knew we monitored, discussed operational details they knew we would find credible, and confirmed threat timelines they knew would trigger predictable American responses. Colonel Marcus Webb, who had been part of the original briefing where Sam was dismissed, spoke with the voice of someone who had learned uncomfortable lessons about his own assumptions. The sophistication of this deception exceeds anything we've encountered in decades of counterterrorism operations. How do we prevent similar manipulation in the future? Sam clicked to a slide showing recommended changes to intelligence evaluation procedures. The countermeasures require both technological adaptation and cultural evolution. We need analytical frameworks that specifically look for deception campaigns, but more importantly, we need institutional mechanisms that allow unconventional expertise to reach decision-makers without being filtered through hierarchies that might discount it. Assistant Director Michael Chun from the FBI raised a concern that had been troubling him since the raids. Lieutenant Colonel, the human intelligence you gathered during your deep cover operation was extraordinarily detailed and operationally specific. How do we institutionalize that kind of intelligence gathering without creating unacceptable risks for our officers? Sam's expression grew serious as she addressed the personal costs of the operation. Deep cover infiltration of terrorist networks requires psychological preparation and institutional support that goes far beyond conventional intelligence training. The officers who conduct these operations need extensive psychological screening, specialized cultural training, and long-term counseling support that recognizes the permanent impact of living among people whose mission is killing Americans. She paused, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. The institutional challenge isn't just recruiting officers capable of this work, but providing them with support systems that allow them to maintain psychological stability while gathering intelligence that requires them to participate in activities that violate their fundamental values and beliefs. Colonel Patricia Hayes, whose analytical background made her focus on systematic issues, asked the question that had been underlying much of the discussion. What concerns me most is how thoroughly our institutional culture contributed to this near failure. We dismissed intelligence that contradicted our assumptions, we discounted sources that didn't match our expectations, and we nearly committed to an operation based on information we wanted to believe rather than information we had verified. Sam nodded, advancing to a slide that showed the cultural factors that had created vulnerability to deception. Military organizations are designed to value hierarchy, deference to senior officers, and respect for established procedures. These aren't negative traits, they're essential for operational effectiveness. But they can become counterproductive when enemies learn to exploit them. General Robert Martinez, representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke with the authority of someone whose career had spanned the transformation of American military thinking from Cold War to global war on terror to current asymmetric challenges. Lieutenant Colonel, what you're describing represents more than procedural modification. You're talking about cultural adaptation in institutions that have succeeded for decades using traditional methods. Sir, institutional culture evolved to meet the threats of previous conflicts, Sam replied carefully. Modern adversaries have adapted their methods to exploit our institutional culture. Our response needs to be equally adaptive. She clicked to the final section of her presentation, showing organizational modifications that would address the vulnerabilities exposed by the terrorist deception campaign. The recommendations include direct communication channels between operational intelligence officers and senior decision-makers, systematic red team analysis that specifically looks for deception campaigns, and rapid verification procedures for intelligence that contradicts established threat assessments. Colonel Lisa Martinez, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the briefing, raised the implementation challenge that everyone was thinking about. The changes you're recommending would require more than policy modification. They would require fundamental shifts in how military organizations evaluate expertise, assess credibility, and make operational decisions. Sam's response reflected months of thinking about these issues during her deep cover operation. The alternative is continued vulnerability to enemies who understand our decision-making processes better than we understand their operational methods. Modern terrorist networks employ sophisticated psychological operations designed to manipulate our institutional responses. The room fell silent as the implications settled. This wasn't just about one intelligence failure or one terrorist threat. It was about adapting American security institutions to face adversaries who had studied American decision-making more carefully than Americans had studied their own institutional vulnerabilities. Colonel David Chun, drawing on his operational experience, voiced the concern that was troubling many participants. What worries me is the possibility that this terrorist network represents a new model that other adversaries will adopt. If they can successfully manipulate our intelligence gathering and analysis procedures, what prevents other enemies from using similar methods? Sam's expression grew even more serious. Sir, based on the intelligence gathered during this operation, similar deception campaigns are already being implemented by state actors who have studied the terrorist network's methods. The institutional vulnerabilities we've identified extend far beyond counterterrorism operations. The recognition phase was complete. 6 colonels who had initially dismissed unconventional expertise now understood that their most fundamental assumptions about intelligence gathering, threat assessment, and institutional authority had been systematically exploited by adversaries who understood American decision-making better than Americans understood it themselves. The transformation was institutional as well as personal. Traditional hierarchies would continue to serve essential functions, but they would need to be supplemented by mechanisms that allowed rapid adaptation to unconventional threats and expertise that didn't conform to standard patterns. The real work of institutional evolution was just beginning, but the foundation had been established through the demonstrated competence of someone who had warned them about vulnerabilities they didn't know existed and proven her expertise through results that spoke louder than rank or traditional credentials. 6 months after Operation Broken Arrow, Lieutenant Colonel Samantha Rhodes stood in a different Pentagon briefing room, but the transformation that had occurred extended far beyond her individual promotion or the successful prevention of terrorist attacks. The institutional changes sparked by that confrontation in Conference Room Delta 7 had rippled through American intelligence services, creating new protocols, modified organizational structures, and fundamentally altered approaches to evaluating unconventional expertise and intelligence sources. The Advanced Intelligence Assessment Center represented the most visible manifestation of these changes, a new organization designed specifically to identify and counter sophisticated deception campaigns. Sam had been selected to lead the center's operational development, bringing together analysts, field operatives, and technology specialists from across the intelligence community to address vulnerabilities that had been exposed by the terrorist network's successful manipulation of American intelligence gathering procedures. Today's briefing represented the culmination of months of institutional adaptation. The room contained representatives from every major intelligence organization, but the hierarchical dynamics that had nearly prevented the original warning about the terrorist plot had been deliberately restructured. Senior officials sat alongside junior analysts whose specialized expertise might be crucial to understanding emerging threats, and the briefing protocols emphasized analytical rigor over rank-based deference. Sam addressed the assembled group with the confidence of someone whose warnings had been validated through operational success, but also with the humility of someone who understood that institutional change required sustained effort rather than dramatic gestures. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago we discovered that our intelligence gathering procedures had been systematically compromised by adversaries who understood our analytical assumptions better than we understood them ourselves. Today, I want to brief you on similar vulnerabilities we've identified in other threat environments. She activated the presentation system, displaying a world map that showed locations where foreign intelligence services and terrorist organizations had successfully implemented deception campaigns against American interests. The methodologies used by the terrorist network we neutralized have been adopted and refined by state actors who possess significantly greater resources and more sophisticated operational capabilities. Director Patricia Vance from the CIA, who had become one of Sam's strongest supporters following the success of Operation Broken Arrow, leaned forward with immediate concern. "Are you saying we're facing systematic deception operations from multiple adversaries simultaneously?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Sam confirmed, clicking to a slide that showed parallel deception campaigns targeting different aspects of American intelligence gathering. Chinese intelligence services have been feeding false information about their military capabilities through channels they know we monitor, while Russian operatives have been manipulating our assessment of their activities in Eastern Europe through carefully crafted human intelligence sources. General Robert Martinez, whose presence indicated the importance Pentagon leadership placed on these briefings, asked the question that was troubling everyone in the room. "Lieutenant Colonel, if multiple adversaries are using these techniques simultaneously, how do we maintain confidence in any intelligence we receive?" Sam had anticipated this concern, having wrestled with the same question during months of developing countermeasures. "Sir, the solution isn't to distrust all intelligence, but to develop analytical frameworks that specifically account for the possibility of systematic deception. We've created verification procedures that cross-reference information through multiple collection methods and analytical approaches." She advanced to a slide showing the organizational structure of the Advanced Intelligence Assessment Center. The center operates with teams of analysts from different intelligence disciplines who are specifically tasked with challenging each other's assumptions and looking for patterns that might indicate deception campaigns. Assistant Director Michael Chun from the FBI raised a practical concern that reflected his law enforcement background. "The verification procedures you're describing sound comprehensive, but they also sound time-intensive. How do we balance analytical rigor with the need for rapid response to emerging threats?" Sam clicked to a slide showing response timelines for different categories of intelligence. We've developed a tiered system that provides rapid preliminary assessment for time-sensitive threats while conducting more comprehensive verification for intelligence that will shape long-term policy decisions. The key is matching analytical rigor to operational requirements. Colonel James Hartwell, whose role in the original confrontation had evolved into institutional leadership for intelligence reform, spoke with the voice of someone who had learned uncomfortable lessons about his own assumptions. Lieutenant Colonel, beyond the procedural changes, what cultural adaptations have proven most important for preventing future intelligence failures? Sam's response reflected months of working with officers who had struggled to adapt traditional military thinking to unconventional analytical requirements. The most important change has been developing institutional comfort with uncertainty and intellectual humility. We've created protocols that specifically reward analysts for identifying gaps in their own knowledge and challenging established assumptions. She clicked to a slide showing training programs that had been implemented across the intelligence community. Every analyst now receives training in cognitive bias recognition, deception detection, and what we call adversarial thinking, the ability to understand how enemies might exploit our analytical methods. Dr. Sarah Williams, a civilian analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency who represented the integration of academic expertise with operational intelligence, asked about the psychological challenges of the new analytical approaches. Lieutenant Colonel, requiring analysts to constantly question their own assumptions and consider the possibility of systematic deception seems like it could create paralysis or excessive skepticism. Sam nodded, having observed this challenge during the center's development. That's why we've emphasized that intellectual humility isn't the same as analytical paralysis. The goal is to maintain confidence in well-verified intelligence while remaining appropriately skeptical of information that seems to confirm what we want to believe. She advanced to the final section of her presentation, showing case studies where the new analytical methods had successfully identified and countered deception campaigns. In the past 6 months, we've identified and neutralized 3 separate attempts by foreign intelligence services to manipulate American policy decisions through false intelligence. The success rate validates the analytical frameworks, but more importantly, it demonstrates that institutional adaptation is possible. Colonel Patricia Hayes, whose analytical background had made her one of the most receptive to the new methods, spoke about the broader implications. What impresses me most about these changes is how they've improved our analytical capabilities even when we're not dealing with deception campaigns. The intellectual rigor required to detect systematic deception has made us better at evaluating all intelligence. Sam smiled slightly, recognizing that Hayes had identified one of the most important outcomes of the institutional transformation. That's exactly right. The analytical skills required to detect deception, systematic verification, assumption testing, alternative hypothesis generation, are the same skills that improve intelligence analysis in any context. General Martinez asked the question that everyone was thinking about. Lieutenant Colonel, looking ahead, what do you see as the most significant challenges for maintaining these analytical improvements over time? Sam had given considerable thought to the sustainability of institutional change, understanding that organizations often reverted to comfortable patterns when immediate crises passed. The greatest risk is that success will breed complacency. As these analytical methods become routine, there's a natural tendency to assume they're sufficient for any threat we might face. She clicked to her final slide, showing projected threat evolution over the next decade. Our adversaries are already adapting to our improved analytical methods. They're developing more sophisticated deception techniques, exploiting new technological capabilities, and studying our institutional changes to identify fresh vulnerabilities. The room fell silent as the implications settled. The institutional changes sparked by Sam's original warning had prevented catastrophic terrorist attacks and improved American intelligence capabilities, but they represented ongoing adaptation rather than permanent solutions. Director Vance spoke for many participants when she observed, "What you're describing is an indefinite cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation. We improve our methods, our adversaries adapt to our improvements, and we need to evolve again." Exactly, Sam confirmed. The goal isn't to achieve perfect security or infallible intelligence. The goal is to maintain institutional agility that allows rapid adaptation to evolving threats. She looked around the room at faces that showed a mixture of professional satisfaction and intellectual challenge. 6 months ago, 6 colonels nearly committed American Special Operations Forces to a mission based on false intelligence because institutional culture made it difficult to challenge established assumptions. Today, we have analytical frameworks that specifically account for the possibility of systematic deception and organizational structures that encourage intellectual humility. She paused, reflecting on the journey from dismissed junior officer to institutional innovator. The transformation didn't happen because of individual heroism or dramatic confrontation. It happened because professionals were willing to examine their own assumptions, adapt their methods, and create space for expertise that didn't conform to traditional patterns. The legacy phase was complete. What had begun as a single intelligence officer warning about compromised information had evolved into systematic institutional change that strengthened American security capabilities. The doors opened by Operation Broken Arrow had created pathways for continued adaptation and improvement that would serve national security interests for decades to come. The cycle was beginning again with a new generation of analysts and officers who understood that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, that institutional assumptions needed constant examination, and that the greatest threats often came from directions that traditional thinking hadn't anticipated. The mission continued, but the institutional foundation for meeting future challenges had been fundamentally strengthened. The warning had been heard, the lessons had been learned, and the legacy would endure through every analyst who learned to question assumptions, every officer who valued expertise over hierarchy, and every decision-maker who remained humble enough to listen when unconventional wisdom challenged conventional certainty. The transformation was complete, but the work of defending American security through intellectual humility and analytical rigor would continue indefinitely, carried forward by professionals who understood that the greatest victories were often won not on battlefields, but in briefing rooms where courage meant challenging assumptions and wisdom meant remaining forever vigilant against the comfortable certainties that enemies learned to exploit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.